So now, a less noisy lecture. It's a terminology lecture. I mean, there is no much videos or pictures. It's a real report that it has to be done like this. Of course, no relevant financial relationship to disclose. So this is like the ICS Standardization Committee report, and the ICS usually has led the development of standardization and definition of symptoms, signs, urodynamic observation, and conditions associated with the lower urinary tract dysfunction. And this is a summary of core terminology reports related to lower urinary tract dysfunction for the use in general medical contents. This has been derived from many of the recent reports and of the very famous old one by Paul Abram in 2002, and combined IUGA ICS International Content Society and Urogynecology Society joint report on the terminology of female pelvic floor dysfunction, and the recent ICS report on the terminology of adult male lower urinary tract and pelvic floor symptoms, and the fundamentals of terminology in lower urinary tract function, and lastly, the ICS report in terminology for nocturia by Hashim et al. So the aim is to summarize basic definitions in the International Content Society standardization of terminology in lower urinary tract function and their application. It is important, as we just mentioned, to do evaluation of the LUTs and looking at the symptoms, the signs, and of course, urodynamic observation if it is needed. And we usually categorize the symptoms according to their occurrence in the micturition cycle into storage symptoms, voiding symptoms, and post-voiding symptoms. There are some problems that arise and can lead to some syndromes like overactive bladder and underactive bladder, or pelvic bladder syndromes. Also, pelvic organ prolapse can be related to lower urinary tract symptoms. That's why we will have to mention the pelvic organ prolapse. So in evaluation, usually the signs are derived from bladder diaries and also can be elicited from the physical examination. Urodynamic observation is usually done by measuring flow rates and pressure measurements. Urodynamic, as you know, is the measurement of flow and pressure. This is all what is about urodynamics, and the pressure measurement include the pharynx cystometry and the pressure flow studies. The methods are the recommendation in the ICS standard on LUTs and are summarized. The terminology is applicable for all patients regardless of gender. So this one is combined to include both male and female LUTs. Definitions of nocturia, underactive bladder, and pelvic organ prolapse are those given in the context-specific ICS consultations or document, as I mentioned. So to start with, the normal lower urinary tract function relies on the facility for storage of urine in the bladder and the ability to pass urine, which is the voiding at the time to suit the individual. The alternation between those two modes of storage and voiding is known as the micturition cycle. So as you can see, the storage takes the most of the time of the micturition cycle, while voiding, we void like 3 or 4 times a day, but we store all the time. So according to if they have normal desire or strong desire to void, this will shift from the storage to the voiding status during the day. So here is where we find the LUTs and the lower urinary tract dysfunction coming if you have alteration of this normal rhythm. Increased daytime frequency is the complaint by the patient who considers that he or she voids too often by day. There is no minimum voiding frequency serving as a threshold for the symptom, so don't come to ask what is the minimum. I don't void much, since this is highly subjective and there is a wide overlap between normal and symptomatic. Nocturia was defined in 2002 that the individual has to wake at night 1 or more times to void, and we lived on this for a long time. Then became the complaint of interruption of sleep 1 or more times because of the need to micturate, and each void is preceded and followed by sleep. In last year, and it is published this year, Hashim et al. Defined that this is the number of times urine is passed during the main sleep period. Having woken to pass urine for the first time, each urination must be followed by sleep or the intention to sleep, and this should be quantified using a bladder diary. This definition actually took a very long time to be approved and to be modified for many months until it has been given in this shape. So because they feel that some patients, if they wake up, they not necessarily sleep again. They can have some insomnia or whatever, so that we reach that it could be followed by sleep or the intention to sleep. And this should be quantified by bladder diary. For the storage symptoms, day and night are considered for the increased daytime frequency and nocturia, and should be referred to the patient's sleeping pattern and not the environmental day and night time, and are definitely related to fluid intake. Healthcare practitioners need to factor in whether the symptom reflects this dysfunction or rather a physiological mechanism dealing with excessive intake of free water or salt. And sometimes they have some medical condition like chronic kidney disease or diabetes or whatever that may have a role in altering this. Urgency is a complaint of sudden, compelling desire to pass urine, which is difficult to defer. And urinary incontinence is a complaint of any involuntary leakage of urine. Urinary incontinence is then subclassified according to circumstances into urinary incontinence as general or stress incontinence, urgency incontinence, and postural incontinence. And this is a complaint of involuntary loss of urine associated with change in body position, for example, rising from a seated or lying position, usually in women more than men. Nocturnal enuresis, mixed incontinence, continuous incontinence, and insensible incontinence. And this is another new one, which is the complaint of urinary incontinence, where the woman has been unaware of how it occurred. And some women, they come to complain of this, and this is actually one of the very difficult complaints. Coital intercourse, which is the involuntary loss of urine with coitus. The voiding symptoms will include the hesitancy and the slow stream and the intermittency. And since you are all urologists, I'm sure that you know these definitions very well. Sometimes we put it for gynecologists. Post-voiding symptoms are experienced with a feeling of incomplete emptying or post-micturition dribbling, and this describes the involuntary loss of urine immediately after an individual has finished passing urine. And all of you receive patients, especially younger age, complaining of this. For the syndromes, you have the OAB syndrome, which is characterized by urinary urgency, with or without urgency urinary incontinence, usually with increased daytime frequency and nocturia, if there is no proven infection or other obvious pathology. And the last sentence is very important to include. Underactive bladder syndrome is a slow urinary stream, hesitancy, and straining to void, with or without a feeling of incomplete bladder emptying, sometimes with storage symptoms. Voiding frequency is again referred to the number of voids observed in a defined time and period, and this can be very well recorded using any of the frequency volume charts of bladder diary. Bladder diary usually gives more information at the time of micturition, the voided volume, the incontinence episodes, the past usage, fluid intake, and degree of urgency and incontinence. So it gives a lot of good information. This is one of the examples. Tomorrow, during the nocturia presentation, I will give more details about the voiding diaries. But then what can you get out of these diaries? Many information, including the daytime urinary frequency, the nocturnal frequency or nocturia, the 24-hour frequency, and the 24-hour urine production. And this, again, is important because, this is important because it gives a very important indication if we are going to look at the nocturnal polyuria. You can have also the maximum voided volume and the average voided volume, median function, bladder capacity, the polyuria, which is excessive excretion of urine resulting in profuse and frequent micturition. It has been defined as over 40 ml per kilogram body weight, or 2.8 liter of urine of a woman weighing 70 kilogram. So nocturnal volume, urine volume, is cumulative urine volume from voiding after going to bed, with the intention of sleeping to include the first void at the time of waking with the intention of rising. And with this nocturnal urine volume and the total, you can bring out if these patients are complaining of nocturnal polyuria or not. The physical examination should cover abdominal, pelvic, and perineal examination. Also, neurological examination is needed and will be more extensive for patients with possible neurological dysfunction. For the sign of urinary incontinence, this is the urine leakage during examination, and you can have these signs during stress urinary incontinence examination, or if there is extra urethral incontinence, and this is the observation of urine leakage through channels other than the urethra. Pelvic organ prolapse is the descent of one or more of the anterior vaginal wall or posterior vaginal wall, the uterus, or maybe the cervix, or the apex of the vagina, or the vaginal wart or cuff scar after hysterectomy. The presence of any such sign should be correlated with the relevant pelvic organ prolapse symptoms. All examination of pelvic organ prolapse should be performed with the woman's bladder empty, and the degree of prolapse may be worse later in the day after a lengthy time in the erect position. The hymen remains the fixed point of reference for prolapse description. There are some also other terminology for the lower urinary tract pain. Most important for us are those related to the lower urinary tract symptoms, like the bladder pain, which is complaint of suprapubic or retropubic pain, pressure, or discomfort related to the bladder and usually increasing with bladder filling. It may persist or be relieved after voiding. Then you have the urethral pain, the vulval, the vaginal pain, and the perineal pain. Also, pelvic pain is important because this is the complaint of pain perceived to arise in the pelvis, not associated with symptoms suggestive of lower urinary tract, sexual, bowel, or gynecological dysfunction. Then you have the cyclical pain, pelvic pain, epidental neuralgia, and the chronic lower urinary tract pain. This is the last section of the terminology report, which is the urodynamic observation. You have the bladder and bladder outlet function, and both need to be considered for full understanding of the person's lower urinary tract. Urodynamics, as you know, is a general term for tests that assess bladder and urethra function during the micturition cycle and includes tests such as uroflowmetry, ambulatory urodynamics, and video urodynamics. It is also used more specifically to indicate filling, cystometry, and pressure flow studies. So what is important during measuring or doing urodynamics is the flow rate, which is defined in the volume of fluid expelled, and it's measured in milli per second. The free flow rate means that no tube is present for recording bladder pressure, and it is important to have it and to compare it to the pressure flow study result, because sometimes you have it very normal, and then the patient is obstructed during the study, the pressure flow study, which means that the catheter is really doing an obstruction for this patient. So it is important to look at this. A continuous flow curve may be a smooth, arc-shaped, or bell-shaped, and it may be fluctuating when there are multiple peaks during a period of continuous urine flow. Maximum flow rate is the Qmax, and it is the value of flow rate after correction of artifacts, all artifacts. The voided volume is the total volume expelled via the urethra. PVR is the volume of urine left in the bladder at the end of micturition. This is an example of a uroflow on the left-hand side, a normal flow of a woman with good Qmax and suitable voided volume and almost full emptying. So this is very normal uroflow. While on the right side, you can see that the curve is elongated and disrupted, and definitely is lower urinary tract dysfunction in this curve. So sometimes the free flowmetry can give a good indication about the pattern of voiding. Both vesical pressure in the bladder, which is P vesical, and the P abdominal are measured together since the bladder is an abdominal organ. P abdominal is generally estimated from the rectal or vaginal recording. P det, or the detrusor pressure, is that component of intravesical pressure that is created by forces in the bladder wall, and it is calculated by subtracting abdominal from vesical pressure. You can see that the record shows continuous tracing of two measured pressures, the abdominal pressure in red and the vesical pressure in blue. And the detrusor pressure is in green, and this is already on the screen on the monitor of the Euroflow machine, the urodynamic machine, and it is subtracted automatically, so you don't have to do anything for this. In this trace, the same trace, you can see that the filling cystometry is preceding the order to void or the permission to void as written, and after this, the pressure flow will follow this. The arrows in pink is showing the atmospheric pressure, and when after connecting the tubes to the patient, there is some rise in the pressure, and it shows the blue arrows, and this is what we call the resting pressures. So the blue oval indicates the resting pressure for this patient at that time. So this is how you standardize your test to make sure that your traces are really put in the real time. Looking at the bladder pressure, so you have the normal detrusor function, which allow normal and relaxing filling of the bladder without any detrusor overactivity or any urgency with provocation. The compliance is the relation between change in pressure in volume over the change of pressure, and is calculated in water per milli. Sensation is the sensation felt by the patient, and the patient will denote this during the filling cystometry. The first sensation of the bladder is the first time the patient is feeling that his bladder is being filled. The first desire is when the patient starts to feel that he can void for the first time, and he can hold the urine without incontinence. Strong desire is when the patient has a very strong desire to void, and he has to stop, we have to stop the filling, and the patient has to void. Filling cystometry assesses the storage phase of the micturition cycle and should be described according to the bladder sensation, the detrusor activity, the bladder compliance, and capacity. So these are the components that give you the figure of the filling cystometry, while the compliance is the relationship between change in bladder volume and the detrusor pressure. These are the standard points in filling cystometry, which is the detrusor pressure at the start of bladder filling and the detrusor pressure and bladder volume at cystometric capacity. These are very important, and according to this, you can calculate many of your standard equations. So the detrusor activity, overactivity, is a urodynamic observation characterized by involuntary detrusor contraction during the filling phase, which may be spontaneous or provoked. And this is, you cannot mention that the patient has detrusor overactivity clinically. You have to do urodynamics. Provocative maneuvers are the technique used during urodynamics in an effort to provoke detrusor overactivity, like rapid filling, cold medium, postural changes, or hand washing. Cystometric capacity is the bladder volume at the end of filling cystometrogram, and it is the voided volume plus the post-voiding residual. The pressure flow study starts when permission to void is given and when uncontrollable, or when uncontrollable voiding begins and ends when the patient considers voiding has finished. Detrusor underactivity is a contraction of reduced length, strength and or duration, resulting in prolonged bladder emptying and or a failure to achieve complete emptying within a normal time span. Bladder auto-obstruction is the generic term for obstruction during voiding and is characterized by increased detrusor pressure and reduced urine flow rate. For male patients, bladder auto-obstructive and the detrusor underactivity can be quantified using the bladder auto-obstructive index and the bladder contractility index. So bladder auto-obstructive index is the P dat at Qmax minus 2Q max, while the bladder contractility index is the P dat at Qmax plus 5Q max. So in conclusion, the ICS standardization provides a logical framework and definitions to describe the symptoms, signs, and urodynamics observation in relationship to the micturition cycle and for patients complaining of lower tract dysfunction. Thank you very much for your attention.